Hello there, it's Jo, one half of the Crypto Sisters, bringing you some information if you're not sure what a smart contract is. Now, this is written by Nick Custodio. You can follow him on Twitter. I thought this was a really good, simple way of getting across what smart contracts are. So I'll read this for you. It's Smart Contracts for Dummies, a reference for the rest of us. So I thought it was really interesting. So here we go. Okay, you know a bit about Bitcoin. You've been seeing the blockchain on the news. But what's this new Ethereum thing? Apparently, it's this cryptocurrency you can use to build smart contracts. Sounds impressive. So, what are they again? They're not that smart, and they're not really contracts, he says. Instead of a one-line definition, let's try to get an intuition. First, we'll revisit the blockchain and the word trust. Then, we'll talk about the word contract. Understanding both words is the secret. So part 1, what we mean by trustless. Most of the time, when we think of Bitcoin or Ethereum, we have a mental image of, well, coins. Aren't these cryptocurrencies after all? Isn't that the whole point? In our minds we see objects, digital gold or silver, or tulips for the skeptics. Because these images are easy to understand, we forget a bit about the thing that's underneath it all. So I say we start thinking about this in a different way. So he's put here digital stone, and you can see all the writing. We have this idiom in English language that goes something like this: set in stone. So, for instance, you would say, this is definitely going ahead because it's set in stone. Now, here's a little thing he's put here, and I'm going to do some funny accents because we've got to be happy in crypto. There's too much negativity. So here we go. I've reviewed the contract, Bob. Looks great. Let's set this in stone. Don't get too excited, Alice. Nothing's in stone yet. This is God. I've written my 10 commandments on these 2 stone tablets. You know, just in case you'll start getting any funny ideas. Sorry about the accents. This metaphor continues to have meaning in the modern world because in the physical ancient world, stone had some interesting properties. Number 1, when you carve something on stone, there is a physical finality and permanence to it. You can't make changes just like that. Number 2, if you try to erase something later on, it'll be obvious. Any changes you make to it are quite transparent and tamper-proof, provable. And number 3, these rules apply equally to all. Stone is neutral. It obeys the law of physics, not men. It doesn't care if you're a powerful king or a peasant. It behaves exactly the same for everyone. Because of all these properties, we have a pretty high level of trust in stone. I mean, there's a reason why we never say, let's set this agreement in sand. Stone is a kind of thing I can point to in the future for evidence. Stone equals solid proof. Not just any material will do. When it comes down to it, a blockchain is really just the above, a kind of material that, though a special mix of cryptocurrency and decentralization has the properties of performance, transparency and neutrality, whatever you put on it. Whether it's a list of how many apples you sent to Joe, not me, or the words, I love you, Jenny, it doesn't matter. When you put it on the blockchain, it's on. Setting something on a blockchain is like setting something in stone. It makes trust easier. Except now we can do it digitally, and that's pretty special. Thinking about a blockchain as a piece of stone you can write things on instead of a piece of currency also helps us understand its broad potential, which leads us to contracts. Part 2. So what do we mean by contracts? The word contract has a lot of baggage. We start thinking about legal documents and lawyers. The go-to description used in the news is a bit better. Things that self-execute or execute automatically. That seems vaguely familiar though. After all, there's really nothing new about automation or execution. The great-grandfather of smart contracts. Take your good old office vending machine, for example. It's a stupid machine that does what it's told. It executes things automatically. It's been around for decades. Behold the magical machine that spits out high fructose sustenance. Let's pretend one afternoon you find yourself in front of this machine. It says, if you give me $2.50 and press this button, you will get a Diet Coke. It might not actually say those words anywhere, but that's the promise this little interaction has. One might even call this kind of simple agreement. You can guess where this is going. You feed in the money, press the button, presto, bottle in hand. You forget this meaningless event in your life 2 seconds later and start worrying again about those darn TPS reports you forgot to do. Well, you didn't notice, but this whole thing was actually a small program, a contract, coded, written into the machine beforehand that ran when you hit the button, signed off on it. Something like, if money received, $2.50, and button is pressed is Diet Coke, then release Diet Coke. Computer code as you see it is kind of like a contract. It's making statements and declarations. There are terms. If you do this and then, and just like someone you trust, it even fulfills its end of the bargain. Voila! Contracts are just code, but unlike a contract in English, this is something both humans and machines can read. Okay, but now you're more confused about this smart contract business. As we said, this is nothing special. In fact, as the vending machine demonstrates, this kind of code is already everywhere in our daily lives. If a smart contract is just if-then code, or any code for that matter, then what's the hoopla? What's actually new? One sunny day you spot a vending machine sitting on the corner. You've never seen this one before. You walk over and take a look. This machine says, if you put in $1,000, this machine will give you $5,000. Whoa! Whoever put this machine together must be very rich and generous, or insanely stupid. Either way, 1K or 5K, no brainer. That's a deal you'll take any day, right? And we've all done this with our lending platforms, haven't we? This is exactly like our good old Diet Coke machine. Same logic, same if-then process. Except now the stakes are different. You reach for your pocket, but suddenly you feel hesitant. Who the hell put this machine together anyway? And what if it eats your money? $1,000 isn't a small amount. You were saving that for months. You didn't think twice about the Diet Coke, but now you realise that maybe vending machines aren't that simple. You start thinking about trust. How do we know it has enough funds to spit out the promised 5,000? How do we know the code is going to run? Is there any way to publicly and transparently verify this code? So the conclusion is, the 5,000 vending machine is an extreme, theoretical example, but it does hint at the problem with scaling trust. In an expanding digital world where people can connect anonymously, trust becomes a tricky thing. We usually rely on third parties and other middlemen for that reason. We have to, especially if we're moving things way more valuable than Diet Cokes. You know, like newfangled financial stuff, or the very idea of value and ownership itself. If only you could marry the automation of traditional programming and the trustworthy properties of digital stone. Well, that is exactly what a smart contract is. It's just code, with a very special kind of backing. Keep in mind, we've had both computation and execution before, but never one that was finalised in a neutral, provable, trustable way on digital stone. How about the real world? A few ideas. Online gaming. Fight fraud on gambling sites. Are the odds of that dice roll you just did actually 1 in 6? How do we know they're going to pay out? Well, why not set the code in stone and prove it? a live example. Supply chains. Maybe track and verify where and how things are made. Voting. Maybe a tamper-proof voting process. Decentralized and autonomous companies. Sci-fi time. Throughout history, automation has always been applied to the bottom of companies, the assembly line, the factory worker. But if the rules of the cooperation are just a kind of operational logic, then isn't it possible to flip the pyramid and instead automate the top? So here's a video that is a made-up smart contract. So it's really interesting. So just have a watch of this, if I can get onto it. Oops.
Etherscriptor is a smart contract builder for Ethereum, and in this demonstration we're going to build a smart contract that imagines a tooth fairy on the Ethereum blockchain. So we'll call this the tooth fairy smart contract, and let's imagine what we want it to do is that a child can supply proof of tooth to the world when he's lost a tooth, and a tooth fairy can supply him some money for having lost a tooth via this contract. So to get started, we'll first want to initialize some values that we'll be using later, and we can do that with this initialize block, which allows us to do some things when the contract is created and then never again after that. But what we'll want to do is in the save slot that we're going to call the child, we're going to want to save some data, and the data in this case is his address, his Ethereum address, and that will be useful later. So let's go grab a real address. This is the Aleth0 Ethereum client version proof of concept 4. This is me, so I'm going to copy my actual address here and pretend I'm the child. And we'll do something similar for the tooth fairy because we'd like to remember their address for later too. It'd be nice to have a real address for that, so let's grab a different one. This is Pat Jack, who had the original idea for a tooth fairy smart contract, so I'm going to pretend he's the tooth fairy. Great. So what do we want to do when this contract is contacted either by the child or the tooth fairy? Well, the first thing is to determine which of these two is in fact contacting the contract. So we can make a condition here that says when the contract caller is equal to the data that we know to be the child's address, then we'll want to do one thing. What do we want to do? Well, let's switch back quickly to this Ethereum client. When you interact with a contract, the way it works is you put the contract's address here, which we'll have after our contract is created, and you can send some amount of money to a contract. You can also send some data to a contract. So in the case of the child, he won't be sending money, but he will be sending data, and the data in question is some proof of tooth that he might have posted on the internet somewhere, and he can supply a URL to that data. You could even supply the image data itself here, but for our purposes, we'll pretend he's just sending in a URL. So how will we get to that data, and what do we want to do with it? I think we want to save it, and we'll save it in a slot that we'll designate as proof of tooth. And where do we access the data that the child would be sending in that case? It's actually available here. It's not in a save slot, but an input slot. That is the input to the contract. And there's a notion of numbered chunks of data when supplied to the contract, and the first numbered chunk is at number 0. So this is actually the URL that we saw the child pretend to input before. So great, the child has supplied some proof of tooth perhaps. Now what can the tooth fairy do when they contact this contract? First we need to test to make sure that is in fact the tooth fairy contacting. So when the contract caller is equal to the data that we've saved as the tooth fairy's address, want to do something. Get that set up here. What do we want to do? We actually want to forward on to the child the amount of money that the tooth fairy has sent, and in fact we can spend not just that amount but the entire balance of the contract that may exist, sending that to the child. And again, we have his address stored in the child slot. So that's okay, but we might want to consider what would happen if neither the child nor the tooth fairy are contacting the address. Somebody else just randomly sends some money to this contract, maybe by accident. It would be nice to send it back to them. So what we're going to use here is this if then else block. It's like a when block, except that it has a alternative condition when they, or rather has an alternative action when the condition is not true. And so we're going to make use of that here to allow the contract to send back any funds that come in from someone that's not the tooth fairy. I've just realized a bug with this logic, because if the child has sent in something, it will do this. Then it will test if the tooth fairy has been the contactor, and it will do this if that's the case. But actually the child would fall into this category too. That's okay. If the child sends money to the address, he should probably get it back, because that's not his role in this. Alright, good. So what should happen is it should send the amount of this transaction back to whoever called it. Great. So we have a tooth fairy smart contract. So you might say to yourself, well, that's kind of silly, and you would be right. It's silly to have a tooth fairy smart contract on Ethereum. But we might imagine that this could be something more serious. So what if this is not just a tooth fairy, but the Tooth Fairy Insurance Company distributed? And this is not a child, but rather a customer. And this is not a tooth fairy, but rather a claim adjuster. So we have here the basic idea behind not just a tooth fairy contract, but a claims process for an insurance company. And so you can see here that this might be more practical in the real world, where a customer would want to supply some proof of goof, that he's crashed his car or flooded his basement, and you can use this same mechanism to supply this proof to the world and to the insurance company, so that the appropriate action can be taken by the claim adjuster. Now, the way we set up this contract, that appropriate action is determined just by the claim adjuster, but this could be expanded in a number of ways. For example, you could have several claim adjusters, such that they vote on the proof of goof and distribute to the customer accordingly. You could include in here an arbitration clause, so that a designated arbitrator would decide the outcome of the claim in the event that the customer and the insurance company register a dispute, for example. So there are many ways to expand on this, but the general idea here is the same for a tooth fairy and for an insurance company claim process. So I hope that has been a useful demonstration, and that you're inspired to create cool things with EtherScripter.
So there you go. So that was really interesting. And also, just while we're on this bit here, if you found that really fascinating, if you come on to Free Code Camp, it's .org, medium.freecodecamp.org, you can actually learn to code for free. So it's really, really interesting if that's what you're into. So these are only a few examples of what you could code on a blockchain using Ethereum's Turing complete programming language. We're only at the beginning. If you can dream it, you might be able to code it. And in many ways, that's what makes this whole thing so exciting. We have some guesses, but honestly, we have no idea what will be built in years and decades to come. All we know is that building blocks are here, and it is open to all. The rest is up to you. So are you ready to go down the rabbit hole? This site has a beginner's guide to Ethereum, crypto tokens, a breakthrough in the open network design, the idea of smart contracts, the other side of the coin, a different perspective on cryptocurrencies. So there's loads on here. It really is worth checking out. Now, as I said, I just wanted to show you this because I think for newbies not knowing what a smart contract was, it's quite a simple way of understanding. especially using the analogy of the Coca-Cola machine. So I thought that was really good. So yeah, come along, have a look at Free Code Camp. I thought it was an interesting site. I will cover some other things on here over the coming weeks. So it's www.medium.freecodecamp.org.